This is Coding Life, where we let the stories of the past shape your future. On this week's episode, we touch upon a very sensitive topic, sexual violence. Now, this isn't a topic that is by any means easy to talk about, but this is precisely why I wanted to have Vedanshi on. Vedanshi digs in to her experience of sexual violence and her friends and her entourage, and what led her to creating a startup that directly tackles this issue. This is an uncomfortable conversation, but to go along with the topic of our podcast, we spoke about the importance of having uncomfortable conversations and how it will lead to the future. More and more, and the more I see it nowadays, we are straying away from uncomfortable conversations, whether it be debates with friends or just trying to understand other people's perspectives. This is why I think this episode is perhaps one of the most important episodes we've ever done. The importance of having uncomfortable conversations and how it can lead to stopping big issues in our world. But before you get listening, there's one more favor I need to ask you. If you could just take a second to subscribe or follow us on any platform you're listening to us on, it would mean the world. In exchange, I promise to offer you and bring you the best conversations you've ever had. My mission is to give you a moment or a question that you can hold on to achieve that next step in your life. Welcome to Coding Life, and enjoy this conversation. Fundamentally, on this podcast, we believe in storytelling, and every story starts with a beginning and an earlier introduction. And so I wanted to ask you, what is your earliest context growing up? We had a chance to speak a bit before this started, and you sound very passionate about a lot of topics. I was just wondering, kind of growing up, I knew you grew up in India. Can you kind of walk me through, like, you growing up, how that context was?
Yeah, so I grew up in a family that was very service-oriented, and I have a younger sister as well. And I think that being an older sibling teaches you a lot about giving and taking as well. Being also one of the younger cousins in, like, my dad's side of the family and my mom's side of the family really taught me about the value of having other people shower love on you. And so I grew up with a lot of love in my life from my family. And so when we immigrated to Canada, I had a different accent from other people. I didn't have that family support system anymore in terms of my grandparents or older cousins that I had back in India. And so I think I was definitely for a period of time feeling very different, like in terms of the way I spoke or the way I dressed or like what my food looked like or smelled like and whatnot. So, and that's sort of how I remember my earlier years in life. At a certain point, being Indian, I think my parents also encouraged me to be in a lot of extracurricular activities while also doing well in school. And so I was very fortunate to have so many different activities that they pushed me to try out. Like I did swimming and martial arts and badminton and dance and all of that. And at a certain point, I came across, this friend of mine that I started a Model UN club with in high school, and he actually ended up being the first person I asked to join in with what eventually became Bolt Safety.
Interesting.
But yeah, I think that's the trajectory.
That's interesting. I see a contrast there between the outside world giving you negative feedback based on, where you were from. But then at the same time, you said that you grew up in a very loving household. How is that contrast like? Was the love at home negating what was happening on the outside, or how's that environment like?
I definitely think you hit the nail on its head because no matter what was happening outside in school in terms of, feeling different or people excluding me or all that kind of stuff, I think that I knew that when I went back home, I was going home to a safe home where, my mom, I remember at the time, would always make sure that she would, whatever she was doing, put it aside. And as soon as I get home, talk to me about my day and how it went. And I think she cared less about the assignments I did or we did math in school and more about how are you feeling and stuff. So I think she taught me the value of my emotions, and emotional validity was given to me from a very young age. And so I think that was able to help me overcome any challenges I experienced from the outside world. And ultimately, I think who you are inside reflects out. And so because I had such nurturing and love given to me at home, I was eventually able to attract people that had similar values as well. And so, yeah, I think I'm really grateful for that.
And yeah.
How did you overcome like the challenge of feeling different or being picked on because you were different? Because normally, like, it doesn't just go away. And I know, although you may get love and care at home, that sense of like feeling like you don't quite belong will probably stick with you whenever you're outside of your home. So did you just push through it? Did you have any solutions to overcome that?
I think that every person's journey when it comes to especially things that they've experienced externally, like literally something as insignificant as something someone said to you in grade 3 is probably going to stick with you until you're 30 years old, and like that person's probably long forgotten about it. But it's the whole experience around learning to embrace and accept yourself. And for me, I think a big part of that was okay, so what if all these people are not including me or don't want to be friends with me or whatever? Then I do think that my parents and my like sister being such a strong support system for me at home really helped me remember like my own worth and value. And so I think the biggest counteract to any sort of like trauma or criticism you get is love. And I think earlier we were talking about like having middle ground conversations and whatnot. And I think the world needs more love in general. And so I think if more people were in an environment that was emotionally nurturing from a young age where they were able to express themselves freely and be themselves, then we wouldn't be in such a necessarily polar or violent world. Yeah,
it's funny that you talk about the grade 3 comment. Even this morning had a my marketing meeting. But yeah, even we spoke about it a bit earlier in the week. But we had someone, there was a comment flying by that, if I see one more post about this podcast, I'm going to kill somebody, right? He was pissed and because he has beef with somebody on the team. But anyways, he said that, and I said, it's crazy how that one comment was the talk of the week, even though we've literally received like 40 positive comments that week.
Yeah.
Which was insane how that one negative comment can completely cloud all the rest. And I think ultimately it stems from a hardwiring in our brains to not get kicked out of the tribe. Because, a couple of 100 years ago, if we're kicked out of the tribe, we die, right? If you're kicked out, you die. So I think it's still hardwired, and I think humans are figuring out a way that, well, we're so many now, right? We're 8 billion people on this planet.
Yeah.
It's fine not to please a certain amount. And I think we're slowly starting to figure it out, and that's probably what you figured out as well.
No, absolutely. And I think that a part of it also is just coming to terms with the fact that sometimes that's just the way that the world is. And, looking at the people that have given you negativity, it's not about you. It's a lot of times it's about them. And like, why are they saying those things, right? It's potentially because they maybe don't have enough love in their life. And so thinking of it from that perspective, and I think there's, like years down the road, you see people mature and they eventually become more accepting and like more mature. And I think that it shows that character arc, and you're like, finally, you're here now. I'm glad you're here. And, I had this like reflection the other day, and I realized that like recently I've been letting go of anger I have a lot more easily, because me being angry at someone isn't going to do anything to that person. Yeah. It's going to hurt me though, because it's going to make me feel bad. It's going to make my energy go down. So I just realized, you know what, like not being angry is for me. And so I'm just letting it go for my own energy conservation. So yeah, eventually I definitely had to think about the ways that I could protect my own energy. Yeah.
I was listening to this podcast yesterday, and it was DOAC and Mel Robbins, and she brought up this point. I don't know if you listened to it.
No, I listened to that one.
Okay. But she was like, the way to gain control of your life is to stop controlling the lives of others. And what they meant by that is that, like, stop thinking too much about this person should be like this person should be like this and do this. Like, the example she brought up was that it was the prom day for her son, and she had so many like preemptive thoughts about like, oh, he should be dressed like this, should be prepared for everything, and really not quite going with the flow. But I think once you start understanding that, hey, maybe some things are just the way it is, and you stop stressing about like your environment and stop stressing about like what others are going to think about you. That's when you truly like have control over yourself and are able to accomplish what you set out to do with your life.
Even like a term for it's like control freaks, right? I feel like we're breeding or we're seeing more and more control freaks, and people want to kind of force what everyone's opinions are, what they should be doing in life day to day. And yeah, we seem to get more and more irritated about people's actions. It's interesting. I don't know if you've seen that on your end, kind of making that realization.
I think working in the gender equity or sexual violence prevention space in general, you meet people that have a lot of opinions on the topic, and you would think that, you know, oh, safety is a fundamental human right. Like, how could anyone disagree with that? Tell you. Yeah, like I'll give an example. Like when we started the Safe Buddies program, like this is like an amateur mistake that we made, but we said that our volunteers will escort people to their destination safely.
Okay.
Now the term escort has like different connotations as well, and like no judgment whatsoever to like people that work in the profession, but as like young people, it's like someone like commented about that. They were like, oh, like escorts, ooh, or not. And then when I saw that, and this was like on CBC News as well, and someone in the comments, and I was like, oh, because I was already nervous about being on this like large media platform, talking about our work with so many potential viewers, and then seeing something like that, and then eventually just being like, you know what, we're gonna fail, it's okay, just let's move past this. And then we changed the wording to a company, and that was that. But you know, yeah,
interesting. Kind of moving into both, what made you develop this passion for kind of safety and just helping others in general? Does it stem from, was your mom big on helping others? I know that's a similar story I tend to see.
I think my dad as well, actually, and you know, my grandparents and my family in general. So I mentioned that I grew up primarily like in Canada, and so my mom would always tell me stories about like family members back home that had, you know, been known to like give back to their community and stuff. And so I think for me it was like, okay, as this young person that's no longer living in India, is living in this foreign country, how do I continue that family legacy to an extent and like make sure I like adhere to the values of the family? Because that's one of the ways that I think I was holding on to like my family back home, even though they weren't there in person with me here. And so I think service is the way that I navigated that. I mentioned I did like a bunch of extracurriculars when I was younger, and so, you know, volunteering was definitely one of them. And the other part I think also of being an immigrant is that you're always looking for a place to belong. And it's like you're not, you know, obviously everyone's story is different. Like for me, this was definitely the case. I think I didn't feel like I had my own place here. Like now, like Vancouver feels like home to me, but like a few years ago it was like, okay, when I go back to India, it's like that's home. But I think after starting with Bolt, you know, the team that I built, like today I consider them to be pretty much my like second family. And so I found my place of belonging by like creating it with all these other amazing people. And I think like going back to your question about like why women's safety, I guess specifically, we entered the Anu and Naveen Jain Women's Safety X Prize because I thought it would be so cool to win this $1 million competition in like grade 10. Even though we were kicked out of it, I think it spurred a sense of awareness about this topic. And then the more I think I opened my eyes and ears, the more I heard stories from people in my life that had experienced abuse and violence. And so the more I was like, y'all, someone's got to do something about this. And so, yeah, I think that's definitely what kept me going, is knowing there's still people out there that continue to experience violence.
Yeah. I mean, just looking at the stats, depending on what source you're looking at, you know, it goes anywhere from between 1/3 to half of women have experienced some type of sexual violence in their life, which is just a shocking statistic. And I think if you tell that stat to most people don't know about it and how big of an issue it is. And I'm sure you've come across some shocking kind of informations. And so what was that moment? Or was there anything like you could share or statistics that even, you know, would shock us about, you know, how big of an issue this actually is? Because I think it's not talked about enough. And so many people are unaware of it, and that's in some ways causing the issue as well. And so is there anything that, you know, you've seen that most people don't even know about?
I think one that shocked me was, if there are 1,000 cases of violence in Canada, only about 33 of those are actually ever going to be reported.
Wow.
And so it's like whatever numbers we're looking at, they're not even necessarily reflective of like the magnitude of the issue. But I think something that, initially when we were getting started, certainly we were looking so much into the numbers, like, okay, how big is this issue, or like how widespread is it? But eventually I realized that people also tend to get desensitized when they look at numbers, because they're like, oh, 1 and 2, oh, that sucks, moving on. And I think if I were to contextualize this in terms of the fact that behind each survivor or victim, there is a friend, or there's a family member, or there are colleagues. There's so many people that are also touched by that violence, because that person's now no longer able to go to work. That person can no longer be a present family member, can no longer be a friend that's available. And that person themselves obviously has experienced trauma, but that violence has touched so many more lives as well. So, we've had people reach out to us as well. We spoke about our Safe Hubs program when we initially launched it during the COVID-19 pandemic. And someone, like literally just one person, but someone reached out to me on LinkedIn being like, hey, I saw you talk about your program. My mom experienced violence, and I hope that this kind of program helps a lot more people like her. And so for me in that moment, it wasn't about all the numbers. It was like, okay, at least there's like that one person we're potentially able to help. So yeah, I think just as people look at the statistics and are appalled by them, as they should be, just remember that behind them there's so many individual stories as well, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
What is defined as sexual violence? Because you mentioned the case of someone not being able to go to work or being able to contribute to society, but I believe there's also people who have experienced the violence but are still carrying on with their daily lives as if nothing really happened. So do you have like a definite definition for this?
So the definition of sexual violence, great question, varies depending on where you are located in the world as well. So for instance, violence in general, it includes a lot of different criminal acts. That could be criminal harassment, which is like stalking, for instance. We just call it criminal harassment in Canada. It could be sexual assaults. That includes rape as well. It could be violence in terms of harassment, physical or verbal. And so it's like a really broad umbrella term about, really, I think the way that I would define it is it's an umbrella term that encompasses any act of violence, verbal or physical, against another person. So, yeah.
I've heard stories of like when someone was offended and they called it like sexual harassment. Is that the case? Like, to what extent does this kind of violence cover?
So that's a really great question, because I was asked a similar question once where it was like, okay, but like this is considered safe for this person to experience, but this is considered unsafe by this other person. And I think what it comes back down to is the concept of consent and boundaries, because different people have different boundaries, and there's no way I think that any law will ever make some kind of a definition that like resounds true for everyone, besides emphasizing that if an act trespasses that boundary that a person has set for themselves, then that is an act that should not be happening. So as an example, let's say that there's someone that is perfectly comfortable like hugging their colleagues, or which is like a very common thing to happen, right? And like work culture here, like, oh, you meet someone, you give them a sidearm hug or something. But then there could be someone else that's like super conservative and they prefer handshakes. And so for that person, without their permission being asked, if they were to be hugged by someone, they're like, oh my God, that was not okay. But then for the other person, it's perfectly fine. So I don't think that people should be using their personal boundary measurements as, defining other people's experiences for them. So that's, I think, a really key part is consent and boundaries.
Interesting. And kind of along that line, because in terms of consent, we know that yes doesn't mean consent, right? And so if, let's say you have a very, jovial boss at a workplace and he's hugging his employees, and for someone that's very uncomfortable, how does that situation plan out in terms of, sexual harassment and sexual assault?
Right. So, great, scenario, I think. We have a workshop program where we sort of talk about this to an extent. And essentially it's like you should be asking for consent before anything in general. So let's say this is a new employee, right? And then the boss has never interacted with them before. Rather than like just going up to that person and being like, oh, here's an arm hug, being like, is it okay if I give you a hug? And just taking those 2 extra seconds to assess that person's comfort level. And then that person now knows that they can always say no, but like they now know that their boss is going to at least respect their yes or no. And so I think it's about setting a tone and a culture of safety and consent. And it so transcends beyond any sort of like, oh, romantic relationships. Like it's something that's in every part of life, the more you look at it. Another like simple example I'll give is if you're in the mall during like Christmas time, there's like, photos with Santa. And then there's always that kid that's like crying because doesn't want to sit on Santa's lap. And, their parents are like, no, sit on Santa's lap. I'll take a picture for you. But then from a young age, you're telling that kid that, their bodily autonomy is not something they have control over. So like when you look at it from that lens, right? Like I think, parents should be like, okay, you don't want to, that's okay. I respect your no. And so that just has to, I think, be magnified into other parts of life.
Interesting. And then in terms of kind of, you've started Bolt, obviously you come from that. What do you do exactly with both? What is Bolt?
Yeah. My favorite question. I can't stop talking about Bolt. But I like to call it a tech startup meets nonprofit. And the reason for that is because we have a digital platform that can be accessed on the Wix mobile app or on any web browser, really. And what we have is a free database of resources for survivors and allies. This includes crisis lines. It includes local shelters. We also explain the process of going through a police report or seeking medical care after an assault, as an example.
Can I interrupt you?
Yeah.
Just asking, what's an ally? Because you mentioned survivor. I can deduce that.
Yeah.
Ally. What's an ally?
So an ally is just someone that wants to support a survivor.
Awesome.
So, with you guys having this conversation, you are allies for survivors yourselves. And so that's just saying that people who are sort of part of the good side.
Okay, awesome. Yeah.
Yeah, and we actually have educational articles that specifically talk about like what is allyship when it comes to the context of like sexual violence prevention. And a lot of it has to do with, okay, if someone comes to you with a disclosure of violence, what is the best way that you can respond to them in a non-judgmental way and be there for them, right? And this could look like, oh, like maybe I'll sit next to them while they're calling the police to file a report, or I'll accompany them to the hospital so they don't have to go and do that alone. So allyship is really just about being present and, helping out where you can. The other thing with allyship also is about being an active bystander. So if you witness something happening, then you, rather than staying silent, do something to intervene to make sure that, if you see someone that's being taken advantage of, you make sure that person gets home safely. And so there's a lot of things that people can do to sort of be an ally. And so, yeah, our platform has all those resources. And then what we also have is Safe Hubs, which is a network of safe spaces in partnership with local businesses. It's currently at 39 locations in 16 communities in Canada. And yeah, it's really exciting because it just shows that there are 39 businesses that have stepped up and said that we will open our doors to anyone that's in crisis, and our staff is here to help support them and guide them to professional support services. So Safe Hubs is I think one of the perfect testaments to the fact that the community can come together for the world to become safer. Good people exist. And yeah, we have a bunch of other programs that we've sort of made tangential to that.
On the topic of like being an ally,
yeah,
people have come to me with like stories, or I was in a situation where they were feeling uncomfortable, but oftentimes I feel like I'm clueless about like what exactly I should do. Sometimes I like to ask the question like, hey, would you like to talk about this? And maybe they don't want to talk about it, but how can I approach someone in this situation?
Okay, I'm gonna need you to illustrate the situation a little bit better for me, just so I can like sort of help like give some contextual clues maybe.
Okay, so
it doesn't have to be real, it could be fictional, but like give me maybe what's the scenario that you would come across.
Okay, so let's say someone I was sitting with, maybe like alone, and we're in a room where there's not really anyone, and they open up to me. They're like, hey, so like someone just did this to me, and how should I respond?
Okay. So let's say that, you are sitting in this room next to someone that has come to you with what is a disclosure of sexual violence.
Yeah.
And so the first thing you could do is, recognize that that is a disclosure. And so, tell them that, thank you for sharing that with me. Because that means that person thinks that you are a safe enough person to come to you with that. So first of all, like, thank them for sharing that and for their trust and vulnerability, and their courage in opening up. The next thing you want to do is ask them how they're feeling. You never want to, start to, I think, pinpoint the details of like what they were doing while that happened. Like, oh, like, did you invite it? Or like, did you wear this? Or like, because that's all victim blaming. So never like go in, that is bad territory. Don't go in that direction. Instead, what you want to do is talk about how, that was wrong of that person to do that to you. And I'm here for you. Tell me what you need. And then if they don't know how you could help them, some suggestions you can give are, would you like me to research professional support services for you? Or would you like me to, like, let's say in the event that it was a sexual assault specifically, and if it's happened within, like, let's say the past week or two, then you would be like, okay, would you like me to accompany you to the hospital and have a forensic examination performed? Because that is something that that person can see tangibly, I think, that, yeah, I'm going to go to this space and then you're going to be there with me to support me through that process. So you can ask that, or you can also ask them if they would prefer talking with a professional crisis line, like a frontline worker. So there's many crisis lines that specialize in sexual violence specifically. And so you could ask them about that. Sometimes they don't want to take action and they just want someone to talk to. And so just whatever choice they're wanting to make, I think as an ally, it's really important that you just support that choice. And the reason that I emphasize that is because when someone's assaulted or has violence done to them, their choice is taken away. So, I think the key component of allyship is respecting the choices that they make from that point onwards. So someone might be like, no, I don't want to go to the hospital. I don't want to file a police report. Respecting that choice and being like, that's okay. I'm still here for you, like whatever you choose to do. Yeah. Does that help you a little bit?
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
I didn't know the forensic sort of existed before.
Do you want me to talk more about that?
Sure.
Okay. So one of the actually projects that we're doing right now is speaking with local organizations that work in the space and putting out like videos of like how someone would seek their services. For instance, like someone that's like never been to therapy has no idea what it looks like to go into a counselor's office. So we're actually putting out like videos that like illustrate that process. And so, the forensic exam, like when I was in Kenya a couple months back, I actually spoke with an organization that's working in making sure that more physicians are trained in conducting forensic examinations. And essentially what it entails from a high level is it's the collection of evidence in the event that that case goes to court. That is evidence. This could include DNA samples. This could include taking the clothes if there's like blood on them or anything like that. And so after a forensic examination is completed, and also it's up to the survivor, like how much of it they want to do. Like they could be like, oh, I don't want like this step to be done. And then the physician like wouldn't, or whoever the nurse examiner is wouldn't do it. Yeah. And so after that is done, one thing to emphasize here also is that the survivor's clothes are taken away as evidence. And so they actually have the option to apply for like police victim services or community victim services actually have funding pools where survivors can get some funding to buy back things that they may have lost as a result of that examination. So if they've lost their clothes or if their phone was cracked in the assault, then that's something that they can get support for after as well. So I think that's just generally speaking that examination process.
Interesting. And then kind of touching on your point, continuing on the bystander, like we spoke about that boss example in the future. So one thing is to live that experience. And the other one is, what if I'm the employee that's looking at that scenario and I see that there's someone who's being uncomfortable with how someone else is, touching them or treating them or talking to them. How would then I react as a bystander? Do I approach the person that's being victimized? Should I go directly to the police? How do I deal with that situation?
I think that in this case, in the specific case of like that workplace environment where someone's life isn't being harmed, I think that you would call 911 if someone was actively like, their life is in danger. But otherwise, especially if that person's not a minor, if it's a minor, it's different. I'll get into that. If they're not a minor, they are an adult, then you would go to that person directly and ask them, what do you want me to do? And this could literally, like, if you're, let's say, in that office situation, and then this person looks uncomfortable as the boss hugs them, you could just go up to that person and be like, hey, I saw that made you uncomfortable. Would you like me to talk to the boss for you? Or something like that. Or what do you want to do? When it comes to minors, however, if you witness any form of sexual violence against minors, then you do have a legal duty to report that. And the BC government website has a hotline that operates 24/7 where that report can be lodged. Yeah.
I can imagine a certain issue when it comes down as we kind of spoke about it before we started reporting, but the lack of reporting that goes on, because I think it's such a traumatic experience for people that they just don't want to talk about it. So how would you kind of go about approaching that issue? Like if you wanted to help somebody, but they don't want to talk about it or report it, do you just kind of know and let them know that there's a space they can go to, or?
Yeah, there's many reasons that people choose not to report. One of them being, of course, that they're not ready to talk about it. Sometimes people report their assaults years later, years and years later. Canada has no statute of limitations on reporting assaults, which is really good. And so, if someone comes to you and they're like, oh, this happened like 5 years ago, I can't report it now anyways, you can remind them that they still can. The only thing they can't do at that point is get a forensic examination because it's been too long, evidence is gone. But yeah, they can still report it. And so how you would approach that sort of scenario if someone was not ready to report is offering them alternatives while respecting their choice. So letting them know that, yeah, it's okay if you don't want to report. That's totally, your choice. Would you like to instead get support from a mental health perspective or from a medical perspective or from a crisis intervention perspective? Or if they're not in a safe space, like let's say they're living with a partner and it's a domestic violence situation, then telling them about, especially if you're like close friends, like even offering them like, do you want to crash at mine for a bit, like while you figure out your next move? So that's a really great way to do that. But then if not, there's also shelters that exist for this exact reason. So yeah.
Interesting. And like even just talking about this, it's so shocking to me because I wouldn't ever think to do violence or try to intentionally make someone uncomfortable.
Yeah.
So why do you think, I'm not saying you have the answer, but just being in the industry, why do you think that number is so high? Like we're talking about 1 in 2 women, 1 in 3 men. How is that number possibly so high when you walk around in the school hallways, you go to a coffee shop, and you expect that most people aren't out there to get you? So how is that statistic, real in some sense?
Yeah. I'm going to go back to something that I learned from the educator at SV Pro at UBC. That's Sexual Violence Prevention and Response Office. Yeah. What they said was we have this perception around perpetrators of violence that they are these monsters that are lurking in the bushes and going to jump at you at like 6 a.m. in the morning when you're jogging alone. That's actually very rare to happen. And so most times actually, perpetrators are people that are very loved, are very well known in social circles. And so I think it just goes back down to the fact that, I have no idea what goes on in their mind, but what I can say is that there's a lack of education on consent, on respecting boundaries. And the other thing also is it's about when people realize that they can't be putting their own needs above someone else's, right? That's the whole point of consent is, so what if it's inconvenient for you or if you really wanted to like hook up with this person, but they said no. And so putting that need above like yours is I think what's more important. And so, yeah, I think it just goes back to like awareness and education. And the fact that people think that perpetrators must be monsters mean we don't recognize them when they're
as well.
Exactly. Yeah.
And why do you think there is a lack of education? Like, to be honest, this conversation is the first time I'm really kind of deep diving into it and asking questions about it. And I even found out sometimes just asking my friends, especially if they've lived a certain experience, they just don't want to talk about it because it's such a traumatic experience for them. So why is there a lack of education on this topic? I would deem that, most people, if you talk about this topic, they would say, oh yeah, it's super important, but then nobody's talking about it. Well, why is there a gap there, you think?
That's definitely something that we realized when we launched our workshop program, because most of us are high school and university students, and going through the high school system, like here specifically, there's one day in the year when there's a sex ed class. If you miss it, that's it. Yeah. And they don't even really address like consent that much, or like
it's my personal hygiene.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, okay, great. But they don't really talk about that. And so I think one of the reasons also is, especially if you're like close friends, like even offering them like, do you want to crash at mine for a bit, like while you figure out your next move? So that's actually very rare to happen. And so I think one of the reasons also is, we have this perception around perpetrators of violence that they are these monsters that are lurking in the bushes and the fact that they don't have it, but they believe, by they, I mean, like, education systems that to this day have prioritized, like, oh, people need to learn about science and math and English and like all of that. And then not recognizing the importance of like actual life skills. Like, okay, you have these highly educated academic people going out into the world, but they don't know how to have relationships, or they don't know how to take care of their own mental health or finance, or like, I don't know, work a spreadsheet or something like that. So I think there's a lot of things that need to change in the current education system and make people really ready to be responsible adults and citizens, right? And at this time, that second half of education oftentimes is given to family members or to religious institutions where people spend their time outside of school or extracurricular activities, but it's not something that's formally given out. And so it just goes back to dismantling that system and revamping it, right?
Do you think also part of it, a big part of our education is our parents?
Yeah.
Do you think sometimes our parents don't have these conversations with us? And how can maybe, if there ever is a parent talking about this, how can parent bring up this conversation and importance of consent as well?
Yeah. I think the fact that, when in movies or like whatnot, and it's every time that a kid is about to hit puberty and parents are like, look at each other like, oh, it's time to have that talk. I think we gotta like stop being afraid of talking about like puberty or like biology and like stuff like that, or like even relationships and sex and all of that. It's such a natural part of life. Like there's how many 8-9 billion people, they didn't just come here on their own. Like, so I feel like it's such a natural part of like human life, and people just gotta talk about it. And honestly, a big part of that is breaking the stigma and making it more normal to have conversations like the one that we're having right now. So one thing that my parents did, which I think that was really cool, was I don't remember what grade it was. My mom went to the library, picked up a book about like puberty. This was way before the like schools even started like teaching us about it.
Yeah.
She just gave it to me and she was like, read that. Ask me if you have any questions. So I read it, and then like we had those conversations and stuff. And so and then my mom, I think for me, even my dad, like like when I got my first period and stuff, my dad literally came up to me and was like, congratulations. And I'm like, Dad, that's so embarrassing. And so I think the way that my parents have made it such a normal, fun part of life has definitely influenced me in how I talk about these things, and will carry forward to, I think, my like future generations as well, right? And so a lot of this is about breaking generational norms as well. So if you come from a household that didn't talk about these things, you have the power to change that. So start talking about it like with your kids and with your peers. So, it's about making individual choices that's going to have ripple effects.
Yeah. Your parents make me very curious, because it's not the typical Indian that you would hear.
It's
so
not.
How come your parents came to kind of being open? Were their grandparents like that, or?
Yeah, I think my grandparents definitely are quite progressive. And so, those are their kids, that it happened. But I think just generally speaking, my parents have always been a little bit of the wild children, I guess, to an extent, from my family. And oftentimes I think the people that we call like wild or like rebels and stuff, they're just the ones that are trying to make things more acceptable to talk about and like normalize a lot of things. And so, when my parents brought us here to Canada, they chose to hold on to the elements of Indian culture, like our religion or the food that we eat and like our values. But they also chose to make it a priority to like, just because these things have historically not been talked about in Indian households, we have now the choice to change that. And like for me and my sister, they've made sure to have those conversations. So there comes the hybrid culture again, I think, to an extent. And I think that especially for people that are so proud of their culture and their religion and the country that they come from, oftentimes it's hard to reconcile the previous set of values with the new ones and like the new country that you're in. And I think that we can be very selective with that. Like these parts of our culture are beautiful and we recognize that, but these parts aren't. Let's change it. And I think society has to keep evolving and changing,
I want to take a different approach to this, and this is coming from, I guess, my perspective as a guy.
Yeah.
So oftentimes in these scenarios, like normally when you think of a victim, you think of like a female, and perpetrator would be like a male. And with this comes a power imbalance in the sense where sometimes like I hear stories of guys getting threatened by like females that, hey, if you're going to like displease me in this way, I'm going to report you. I'm going to say you did this to me, and you're going to get locked up and whatnot. And oftentimes, like, these cases are really hard to disprove. And even with like Johnny Depp and Amber Heard, like that case blew up. And before the court proceedings, like Johnny Depp was getting like trashed online, and he was losing sponsorships and whatnot. And I know there's like hundreds of cases, maybe like thousands or millions of cases like that out in the world where like stories are unheard of, and like reputation is a big thing that is attached to, and once it's damaged, like it's really hard to get it back, even though like you may have been falsely blamed. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah.
There was actually this case in India where, you know, we have like Uber Eats and like Skip the Dishes.
Yeah.
So I forgot what the service was, but like one of those in India as well. And this delivery person, this guy actually, he went to deliver the food or the meal, and then it was the client, who was a woman, who was the one that was actually harassing him. But then she was like, I'm going to tell people that you sexually assaulted me, and that became a huge case. And I think the delivery guy ended up winning in that case, which is really nice to see when people hear the survivor without prejudice. And I think we're living in a time where the narrative is becoming really dangerous. And I'm saying this like as a woman. There are a lot of women out there that commit crimes as well, and I don't think that being a woman automatically exempts you from the fact that you could be a perpetrator as well. And it's, you know, just going back to the conversation I think a lot of parents have with their children. If they're daughters, they tell their daughters like, you should stay safe, but if they don't tell their sons that you should be safe people. And so if at the same time that we're dismantling that, and we're telling, you know, the sons to be safe people, and we're telling daughters that if something happens to you, it's not your fault, at the same time we also need to be having conversations that it shouldn't happen the other way around as well. And so hot take, my whole thing with feminism, right, like the term feminism itself is supposed to mean equality of the sexes. My personal thing is, I think a lot of people are misunderstanding that to be women on top. Like now it's like women's time or like whatever, and I think that it is understandable given like history and like all the years of oppression that women have experienced for them to finally want to be on top. But I think we need to be in a place where everyone has equal right and dignity and respect and all of that. So when we're talking about awareness, it's not like one-sided. It has to be happening with everyone involved. So certainly I think that the reason that those things are happening more and more is because society has been successfully conditioned to look at issues from one direction only, but we need to have those middle ground conversations that not all crimes look the same.
I know it's kind of like a scenario that I have in my head is, just say you have the start of the Me Too movement. Amazing. People are starting to come out and report. It goes too far one way where people start accusing falsely of men, and now you have the Amber Heard and Johnny Depp situation, and now it's creating the opposite effect where people are like, oh yeah, women are just lying about everything.
And it's like...
So now you have this, you have a situation where, let's say there's a soccer player, he gets accused. You have one camp that's saying, oh, well, she's just bullshitting. We don't believe what women say. And then the other camp is saying, well, the soccer player is definitely wrong and we just can't. It's just this polarity that's been happening.
No, exactly.
It's kind of sad to see, definitely.
It is. And I think social media to an extent is also accelerating the rate at which like these things are happening, because the way that the algorithm works is that the content that you engage with, you're going to see more of. So let's say there's someone that starts engaging with content in this direction. They're going to see more and more content in that direction, and that's going to ratify their worldview in that, you know, lens. But for someone that like is looking at conversations in this direction, that's going to be like the rabbit hole they go down. And then when these people meet, when they're already on such different ends of the algorithm, in real life, it's suddenly they're incapable of having those conversations where they can meet in the middle, because they're so, you know, set in their values from this. And I do think social media to an extent conditions people to look at things in a certain way. And it's so easy, I think, also to, you know, report accounts, which is a really valuable tool in cases of harassment and whatnot. I think there should be better action taken around that, because there's been so many times I think accounts are reported and they're just not taken down. But at the same time, what it also means is if someone has a different view from you, you can just delete the comment. You can block that person. You can't do that in real life though, right? How can I be like, I'm gonna block you?
Yeah.
No, I'm mentally blocking you right now. Like, and so because of social media also, I do think people are forgetting what it is to be human
Yeah.
and have those middle ground conversations.
Yeah. Different conversations. Even I had this reaction recently where someone would bring up a conversation. I'm like, oh, this is interesting. Let's talk about it. Let's do devil's advocate and discuss the different points. And the reaction of that person is to laugh and say, no, I can't have this conversation with you right now. You're ridiculous. I'm like, come on, have the conversation. Let's discuss both points. But we just live in this world where if you don't agree with me, then I'm just going to delete your comment and block and not look at you, as opposed to having that middle ground conversation. I think it's sparking the violence that we're seeing in the world today because we're just not allowing for those uncomfortable conversations. And something that I read from Stephen Bartlett, who's the founder of Diary of a CEO, and he said, your ability to be successful in life is your ability to have and be able to have uncomfortable conversations. And I think we're losing sight of that.
Absolutely. And I think also it's like, as a simple example, like, if someone breaks up with someone over text and it's like, why? It's because they can avoid the emotional, pain of like doing that in person and having to deal with that other person's reaction and stuff. And I think that these tools are so great. Like I mentioned, I live away from my family across the world, and I've been able to stay in touch with my grandparents as, thanks to technology. But it doesn't mean that like, we should be letting that infect like real relationships that we do have the capacity to have in person. And I think pain and suffering is just as equally important to experience in life as happiness and joy. And people are on this, this dopamine sort of rush because of socials, and they don't want to come down from it to reality. Yeah.
We had a conversation that we got to have with head growth manager at Spotify.
Yeah.
And Brandon asked, like, are you happy in life, or something along those lines, right? And ultimately he responded, well, is that the right question to be asking ourselves? Is the goal in life to be happy? Maybe not, right? Maybe we have it all wrong. And typically when you ask most people what their, top 3 goals are in life, one that comes out is
be happy.
Yeah, I want to be happy in life, right?
Yeah.
But is that necessarily right? Sometimes I've heard, I think it was a professor, but she said that, the pursuit of happiness is in some sense very hedonistic, just in the sense that you're really looking for those short-term dopamine hits. And maybe social media has something to do with that. Our brains have been completely wired to look for those quick dopamine rushes. And I think that's why when you ask most people today, what's your goal in life? It's to be happy. I think if you would have asked just a couple of years ago, I don't think that's the answer. I think the answer is raise a good family, raise children that are going to be or achieve great things in life.
Yeah.
I think it was way more about being proud and legacy and doing work for others as opposed to
for yourself.
Yeah.
And
everything you do for yourself. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I heard Simon Sinek say this recently, but there's a whole section, right, which is self-help. There's no section about help others.
Yeah.
Where's that section?
I do think that the social impact sector to an extent comes in that to fill that gap as well. But even then, there's a lot of people who get into social impact for personal branding purposes. And so, I think that we can't forget that the purpose of service is to help others without any benefit or any expectation for yourself. It's really sad.
Yeah. And the interesting thing is, I think if you go around and ask most people when they feel most fulfilled, I think typically the answer you'll get at is some way or shape or form of helping somebody else.
Yeah.
And so why are we pursuing all these selfish goals if what makes you most fulfilled and quote unquote happy in life is by helping others, right? Especially, we're in business school, you're in science, it's a bit of a different background. But especially in business school, it's like a lot of people are selfish. Especially now, I feel like as we go up in the years, it's getting a lot more competitive. I think perhaps it's the competitive nature of society and kind of you try to top each other. That's creating this thing where, well, I need to care about care about my own before I start helping others. But, I fundamentally believe that helping others is the fastest way to grow. So, but yeah, it's interesting to ponder.
Okay. I'm going to science you guys right now. So I did this course earlier this year and the professor was talking about altruism.
Okay.
So do you think that people can be inherently altruistic or not? And I will back this up with like an argument. What the professor was saying was because of evolution, survival of the fittest in like biology. And so it's like, if you help someone else who is of the same species or from the same family, then it's ensuring greater progeny down the road.
Yeah.
So inherently, it's selfish to help others.
Yeah.
Or do you believe that people can truly be altruistic with no real benefit to themselves?
Yeah. I think it's a selfish approach, and I'll give my argument later. But what do you think?
When you frame it like that, it sounds like simply by helping the world, by helping anyone, I believe that in some way it's helping yourself. So I guess all our actions, as defined by the example you gave us, is inherently selfish. And yeah, I believe the world goes full circle. So like, if you're trying to help someone, like, sure, maybe like down the road, they might not like give back exactly to equally. However, like what you derive from the feeling of helping others, what you derive from the feeling of just giving back and doing something nice helps yourself as well. And because of that, like all actions that you kind of do are in your favor.
Yeah.
Or at least are favorable to you.
And see, and I would agree with them.
Yeah.
But that was kind of my point from earlier, is that if the things, and I think that's why we're wired that way,
Yeah.
the thing that makes us feel most fulfilled is helping others. So even though it's coming from a selfish place because it's making us feel good, but I think we're probably biologically programmed to help others in that way, that the greatest joy and experience we can achieve is helping others.
Yeah.
Because that's what prompted survival and to build civilization.
Yeah.
So what's your answer?
I agree with that. I think that it is, to an extent, all altruism is selfish. But at the same time, like, the argument that I used in this specific class, I actually used Bolt Safe Hubs program because I said that these business owners, beyond like being named on our website and like as our Safe Hubs partners, they're not getting a ton of fame or recognition for being Safe Hubs. We're literally asking them, like, out of the goodness of your hearts, would you be willing to be a safe space? And people are doing it, and it's actually at a cost to them, right? Because they are they're putting aside like items to give to these people, or they're paying for that out of pocket as well. And so I think that if we don't think about like how helping someone helps all of humanity, I think altruism can exist to an extent in society. I think people can be selfless.
Yeah.
Still. Yeah.
I think it's selfless just means that the greatest joy you receive in life is by helping others, I think, in a weird way. Like, it always does come back to you, but I don't think that's a bad thing. I think we make it bad that you receive personal enjoyment from helping others.
Yeah.
That's fine.
Yeah,
I think the world should operate in that way. If everyone realized that the greatest joy you can experience is by helping others, oh my God, where would we be as a society, right? And that's what's so interesting. How have we diverted to all this selfish me?
Yeah.
It's interesting.
That is so true. There was this example from like the story that I read in childhood.
Yeah.
And what it was is, so in ancient India, they used to have gurukuls, which is essentially like these schools where these people would go. And this guru, or like the teacher, had these students sitting across from each other, and he had the most like delicious meal on the table. What he did was, though, he like tied each person's arm so their elbows were locked. They couldn't bend their elbows. And he was like, now enjoy the meal. And so everyone is sitting there like trying to put the food in their own mouth, but they can't bend their elbows.
Yes.
And so
I saw a graph.
Right. And then eventually they realized that they could just feed each other and still enjoy the same meal.
Oh.
So that sort of, I think, sums up also like what you were saying.
Yeah. That's interesting. I think definitely something we'll try to do on this podcast is bring out people that do curate that message of helping others. And the message of helping others is the fastest way to grow, I think, is one that needs to be spread, especially just bringing it back to school. So many people think, well, I'm not going to share my assignment because if I share my assignment, he'll get a better grade than me, right?
Yeah.
But they don't realize that if you teach scientifically, teaching is the best way for you to remember something. Yeah. So by actually helping him do his assignment, you'll benefit from it.
Exactly.
Right? People don't go just that extra step.
Yeah.
I also have like,
and it's in a selfish way, they owe you one now. So, but I don't think
exactly.
Like when you're stuck on an assignment, they can help you out as well in the future. So Yeah.
Yeah, I was just going to add my personal experience to that. So starting off like this term, I had this class that had like 5 assignments throughout the course of the term.
Yeah.
And for like very first assignment, I just shared it with like my friends, asked for their emails, like, hey, I can send you my answers after you. Like, I'm done. And then every time afterwards, they'd always like send me whatever answers they wrote, like without even me having to approach them to do that. And through that, they remind me, oh, like the due date's like this date. And like, you also get to compare answers and whatnot. So it's like win-win for everyone. And I like typically see that outside of business school and whatnot, people don't communicate as much. And that's when people like really keep the answers to themselves and are like really competitive in this space. And they don't realize that by simply like talking to other people, maybe you can like learn something from others that you didn't know beforehand, and in return like you learn something from that. But yeah, people from my personal experiences, it's like people don't really like to share.
Yeah. I was speaking to Professor Carrie Marketing. I think she has a PhD in education. Correct me if I'm wrong, Carrie. But what she was saying is that we really need to have a discussion about how competitiveness is killing a lot of things in terms of creativity and just collaboration and helping others.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, any story of backstabbing typically falls down to, someone just trying to be bigger or greater than the other person. Yeah, I don't know if you've had any experiences like that and more on the sciences side.
Actually, a professor did something that was quite remarkable. And what he said was, everyone in this course is guaranteed to get an A or like whatever grade he said. It was like, as long as you participate and you like do all the assignments and whatnot. And so I think immediately the shift in that class's culture was not, I need to get the best grade so that the scale is in my favor, but more so, I can actually, for once, not care about my grades, and because I know I'm guaranteed a really good grade anyways. And let me just focus on working with my peers on building something really cool in this class in the time that we have. And so I think that is like fantastic, because like 10 years from now, who's going to care like what grade you got on that one course? But in the moment, you don't see that. So definitely competition in academic institutions, even in social impact and entrepreneurship, it definitely exists. And ultimately it's, if you are expecting people to, open their doors and like be friendly towards you, I think it's also important to take the first step. And sure, maybe no one's reached out to you before, but similar to like how you like were the first one to give that answer to your friends, I think it's important in the rest of life as well to like, okay, sometimes you have to be the one to start opening those doors for people first before they can help you too.
And then, what's the future for Bolt then? Kind of on that topic, if you spoke about helping others for a bit now. So, what's the future for Bolt?
We actually, funny enough that we were talking about like how helping others and whatnot, because I think Bolt's principal goal is to be a centralizing hub for all existing efforts. And so I mentioned earlier, our database has all those like shelters and crisis lines and like all these experts. So really what we're trying to do is make sure that all of that is more accessible and more understood. And so that's something that Bolt is doing under an umbrella project, which is an ongoing research and documentary project. And we've never done a project to this scale before. So I'm really excited to see where it goes. And I think that, at the end of the project, hopefully it can help a lot more people understand these issues better, but also see that there's so much work happening in the space so that there's hope. I think a lot of people get very hopeless when they look at statistics and hear really devastating stories. So hopefully Bolt can keep fostering more hope in the right direction.
What gave you that hope when you saw those statistics?
Yeah.
What was it about you that made you think, I can make a difference here?
I think it was... Actually, I don't even think it was about me. It was, I know people in my life that I could work with. Like, I didn't think that I could do it on my own, to be honest, like from the very beginning. And so we have 6 co-founders, which I think is very atypical of an organization. Yeah. And so, but that was so wonderful because every person brought such different experiences to the table, and together we were each able to contribute something different. Like one person was better at marketing, one person was better at like CS and like actually developing the tech, and then one person had the connections and the network. And so when we came together, it worked out. And I also think it goes back to this childhood story my mom told me, where basically all these birds are caught by a hunter in this net, and the net is really heavy. And then I think a crow comes along, and the birds are like, help us, like rescue us. And the crow tells them that I can't lift this net on my own, but if you all fly together at the same time, we can fly with the net. So even though that like challenge still existed, because they were in unison, they were able to fly away and escape, and the hunter came back and the birds were gone. And so just remembering that, we're stronger together.
Yeah. It's interesting. Even like going back to the school conversations.
Yeah.
Most of the things we've been examined on have been individualistic.
Mm-hmm.
We have projects here and there.
Yeah.
Sure. They're not in the majority. Not nearly in the majority. So I just had this realization now. What is that telling, people growing up? If I'm growing up where everything is me, me, me.
Yeah.
Well, obviously I'm going to prioritize like my own individual performance. Right. But I don't know. It'd be interesting to have this experiment where if we were only evaluated on team projects, I wonder how things would shift that.
Cool. That'd be cool. Yeah. Actually, the course I mentioned to you earlier, the whole course was a group evaluation. So, maybe.
Interesting.
Yeah, because I feel like normally in school, in the typical classes that we sit in, like all the way from like when we're like 4 or 5 until we're like fully grown adults, all of the classes teach you how to think and teach you how to do something. Like how to solve this math equation, how to do this like chemistry like project. But it never really teaches you the human skills that you really need to take away. And I'm sure Bo wasn't like born from like inspiration that you got from math class and whatnot. But dude, how do you think we can change the education system to like better benefit humans? And another like thing to think about is that a lot of the entrepreneurial stories that like really stick with people is that they get C's and D's in classes and they never do good in the education system. But at the end, in the long run, they're the ones helping others more than the people who got the A's in the classroom can.
Y'all really exposing my GPA over here. No, but for real, I think I spend a lot of time outside of school that my school grades are questionable sometimes. But I think, your question about how we can change the education system there's a lot of aspects of it that need to change. And I think that people that have been working in social impact in many different areas can probably contribute to that. Like in the sense of like someone working in climate probably feels strongly that we should have better climate education and sustainability education. I actually made a student documentary on the topic when I was in high school. And it really just goes back to the fact that we have people doing all this like social impact stuff, but it's considered to be not important. It's outside of school if you're not getting graded on it. And in fact, a lot of parents discourage their children from volunteering too much or being too involved out of school because they want them to do better on things they're actually graded on. And I think the moment, it goes back to like, okay, should grades even matter? But I think the moment we start grading people on how respectful are you, or like how much of a culture of consent or inclusivity do you foster at the school, or how involved are you? The moment we start valuing people for their service to others and their willingness to, I think, leave the world in a more positive space than when they came into it, people will start prioritizing that naturally, just given how competitive we are. So I think we just got to shift the competition.
I was walking back from home, and I'll share this thought. It was like a 12 a.m. thought.
Yeah.
And I was thinking of my prof, and I said, wow, I had this conversation with him after class. I was like, wow, what a smart guy. Like, his intelligence is not reflected in the course at all. So I was thinking, okay, well, why not? In the sense that a course structure needs to be a certain way and needs to be evaluated and graded. And there was kind of different thoughts coming in at the same time, because one of my profs said, and he's like a Harvard, MIT graduate, and he said, if you guys were graded, I would teach this completely differently. Which is so interesting, because I realized we're paying, and you can look up on UBC, the salaries of our profs. They are huge sometimes. And yet they're being told to teach in a certain way, or they're restricted by, you need to be able to grade your students. It needs to be between this percentage and this percentage. And I was thinking, well, what if there was a world where you just hire your prof and tell them, can you teach the best course you can possibly teach? No need to evaluate, right?
Yeah.
And I was thinking, well, isn't a school or an education system ultimate goal to simply evaluate and to simply educate.
Yeah.
Because if it was to truly educate, why would you have a grading system?
Mm-hmm.
If someone's paying you money and let's say they don't listen to class, well then,
That's
you're
their
gonna-
loss.
yeah, that's their loss, right? You should only be focused on providing an environment which is best to educate. But I think if you look at the reality of the thing, and there's been plenty of articles written on it, it's not, conspiracy theorists at all. Ultimately, if you track back, who's funding the schools? The government. Who's funding governments? Well, it's billionaires that are, playing the systems and paying politicians to do laws that are in their favor. So ultimately, the schooling system is made not to create the best educated people. It's really made to just create the best employees.
Mm-hmm.
Because, and it's a simple thought process, because if you had a big company and you wanted to grow and you just wanted better employees, what you would do, well, educate someone and create a system where you can grade the entire population and I'll just pick the best ones.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why I think the grading system exists. But it was just a shock that,
Capitalism.
yeah.
Capitalism everywhere.
No, no, it is. And it's such a simple thought process that if we were in that position, we'd probably try to create a schooling system that we have today. But it was just inspiring that we're hiring all these hyper intelligent people. Like a lot of our profs have, gone to the best schools in the world, have the best educations, and yet we're telling them how to teach. How about, we just hire them and let them do what they're good at? So I just thought it was this interesting thought process.
That is interesting. I feel like it'd be really cool for you guys to potentially even have a conversation like this with faculty members and see what did they think about the knowledge they actually get to impart on their students. Actually, my physics professor from my first year, I was having a conversation with him, and what he said was that, with AI and everything, like, I don't even really need to teach because you guys could learn everything I'm teaching you off like Google and like watching YouTube videos. And so we were arguing about, like, I was like, no, professors are still valuable because, like, for me, like, I can't understand from the internet. And then he was saying, but like, generally speaking, the value of professors is declining because we have whatever professors currently do can easily be replaced. So then what is the value of humans and human intelligence in the world of artificial intelligence?
And I think, like, going back to the prop that created that environment, well, everyone can get an A, just participate in group projects. I think that's something technology can do, like foster that community within the classroom and collaboration. And I think, I wonder if we'll see that pivot throughout our lifetimes. It'll be interesting to see.
Yeah.
Do you think well, I guess it's I'm no like expert in
No, I think none of us here are, but
I would tell. But from what I feel, it's like, hey, maybe like knowledge would become so accessible, like it's not really a point of like going to university anymore, just purely for like the education purposes. But things we can learn in the future may truly become useful, like how to build a good relationship, or how to like curate this environment, how to build a team culture and stuff like that.
Yeah. And again, I think something schools aren't teaching is teaching us to be uncomfortable. I think, again, there's like all these support systems and it's too hard. Like the class had average wasn't good, so we're going to curve it, right?
Yeah.
So we're curating this environment where we're challenging even our students less and less, and it just goes back to that uncomfortable situation, uncomfortable conversations again. I'm reading this book, and that's why I'm kind of bringing it up, called The Comfort Crisis. It was written by Michael Lesser. He's a professor at the University of Nevada. And he just talks about how a couple of years ago, and he gives this example about the weather. And he says, just 2,000 years ago, we experienced the weather every single day. There was no, air conditioning. We lived in the weather. It was cold, it was cold. It was hot, it was like boiling hot, it was boiling hot. That's what it was. Now, when do we experience the weather now? On your walk to the bus station? Like 5 minutes, as opposed to 24 hours in the past? We've curated this environment where we're completely safe. And now we're even shying away from conversations, right? Like, forget like survival in the wild. Like, we're shying away from simple, uncomfortable conversations, which is just crazy when you think about it. I think there needs to be this real thought process on, okay, how do we enable, discomfort? And kind of, as you said, I loved when you said it, that we need to prioritize pain as much as we do prioritize happiness. Like, they're equally important. They're counterbalances, right?
Yeah.
I think most of life is just about balances, and it's about finding
Absolutely.
that.
Yeah. I had a friend that hiked Mount Kilimanjaro.
Wow.
So actually his name...
Our age, or?
Yeah, a couple of years older. His name's Arpan, actually. Arben Grover. It was me, Arben, and Zian that went to Kenya together.
Oh, awesome.
And so Zian, you guys saw his episode already.
Yeah.
But basically, he went and he hiked Mount Kilimanjaro. And I think that for someone like me, who was like, does not even like biking to school, because I'm like, what if I get tired halfway there? And I'm like, what am I supposed to do with the bike? But he just went up all the way up to the mountain where he can't just like, I don't know, fly back down. Like he has to go up and he has to go back down, right? And so it's like, just thinking about people, I think that spend more time in the outdoors, generally speaking, I think tend to embrace the discomfort.
Yeah.
Like you literally, like even people that hike, like if you do cardio, like I'm a boxer, so I do boxing and stuff, but I know I can like stop boxing at any point if I feel dizzy or something, right? And I was like, oh, I'll be safe. You know, I'm in a gym, I'll be safe. But I feel like I think part of what scares me about hiking is that you're out there and like you have to get yourself back down as well. And so I don't know, maybe people should just go on more hikes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, we're not talking about sell your house and just start living in the wild. But it's just I think even in the book was saying like just try going a bit out of your comfort zone.
Yeah.
And then there's this idea about inakis, I think it's called. It's a Japanese phrase, but it's basically you need to find things and so he does one a year. I need to remember the term.
Was it ikigai?
No, ikigai is a different thing.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Like, oh, this is what I've heard.
No. But it's a different thing. But the whole concept is simply that every once in a while you have this thing where you should think that you only have a 20% chance of achieving it, or like a 50% chance of achieving it. And what that will do is you think your potential is here. Well, it's actually here. But the only way you're going to know that is by pushing and testing those boundaries.
Yeah.
And so what he kind of tries to do is to, once a year, try to find that thing where he can push himself and really get out of his comfort zone. And he said the thing that did for his confidence is huge. And so, yeah, I think we need to just, as a society and as an individual, especially if you're into self-improvement, just embrace discomfort.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I like that a lot because I think my New Year resolution, like one of the points was I used to have things like I'll wake up at like this time and like exercise this many times.
Yeah.
But this year I think I focused more on like who I want to become and like the values I want to lead with. One of them was to do things that make me scared, like do things that terrify me.
Yeah.
And I think that we have to be not afraid to be afraid.
Yeah.
And then I don't know if you've ever seen the omelet model of so there's the omelet model. If you're in the yolk, like the yellow part,
Okay.
that's your comfort zone. And then like the white area is like your growth zone. That's out of your comfort zone. But if you're never in the white zone, you're never going to grow. And so the more you go into like the growth zone, the more your comfort zone also naturally expands. And so it's like if you don't push yourself for growth, you're going to stay in the same spot and be stagnant for your whole life. But the more you push yourself, the more you can be a delicious omelet.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
Yeah.
People always say like fake it to make it, but I don't truly believe that. Like no one's ever faked it.
Mhm.
Like no one really comes into this world with confidence. It's because of the environment they're in, like whatever experiences they have been through that really contributes to however much confidence they have today. So for everyone like starting to make the initial step to step out of their comfort zone, that's the only way I believe that can grow your comfort.
Yeah. It's just a feedback loop at the end of the day. You think you can't go to the gym this morning, you're tired. If you somehow got yourself there, wow, okay, I can go from a place of not wanting to do it to doing it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's just this concept of self-confidence. We spoke about this with kind of Andre as well.
Yeah.
And just building that confidence loop is so important, and just finding those things that just push yourself out of your boundary just a bit every day. And I think, again, like goes back to our entire conversation, like the uncomfortable conversations that we're not having, right? Yeah, no, it's interesting.
I think the other thing also is like people are too afraid to fail these days. Like they think that if they do something, they must succeed.
Yeah.
But you should be okay with failure because you learned so much more from failure, I think, than you do from winning.
Yeah.
And too often we prioritize like, oh, we have to be successful in doing this. No, this is going to be a valuable learning experience. Then let's do it. Because there's many things you can do that you would be successful in because they're in your comfort zone. But because there's a risk of failure, you're also risking, or not risking, but you have the opportunity to like grow so much more. So I think we need to embrace failures.
Yeah. I think we've stigmatized it. Like,
Yeah.
how many times have you heard, oh, you're stressed, oh, breathe, relax, right?
Yeah.
Or, oh, you're feeling sad, so, like, it's okay to be sad. Like, I feel like we, in the sense that these bad feelings that we have, we, like, stigmatize them and said, like, no, you're not supposed to be feeling this, right? And we set the objective to, like, happiness. But all it is, like, sadness and things like stress, they're just feedback. They're just our body's telling us that, you know, this is good, or you need to react in a certain way. Yeah, especially when it comes down to stress, like we've completely demonized stress. Like it's not okay to be stressed nowadays.
Yeah.
But you know, for hundreds of years, stress was just a way to tell us, hey, like activate our senses, right?
Mhm.
It was just that. So even in my perspective, like growing up, a lot was like, ooh, you know, I like stress. And I was reading a study.
Yeah.
Maybe you've came across it, but it's fascinating. People that perceive stress as a good thing have 30% like higher chances of living, and there's like a whole loop of, you know, how it goes down. But yeah, no,
Yeah.
it's interesting.
Yeah, absolutely.
As this conversation is coming to an end, we'd like to do this tradition where we get your thoughts on a quote left by our previous guest. And this guest is from this previous guest is a youth from the World Economic Forum. And the quote goes, "See the world as yourself. Have faith in the way things are. Love the world as yourself. Then you can care for all the things." What are your thoughts?
I love that. I think it ties back to a lot of what we talked about today because if you see the humanity in other people, just tying this back to the whole conversation we had earlier about why is sexual violence still happening, it's because there's that lack of, like, you know, cultures of consent and respect. And the moment that you respect other people and give them the same level of dignity and respect that you would to yourself, I think the world would be, you know, a much happier place in general.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think it is really fundamentally about respecting other people and giving the world a lot more love, like we said at the beginning as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And again, as we said, like if parents are able to have uncomfortable conversations,
Yeah.
talking about like these issues or things that are happening, I think we're going to breathe a more educated and cultivated society. If you know, if you can talk about uncomfortable situations and conversations with friends, they're going to be more educated, right?
Yeah.
So I think again that importance, and then always do it from a place of love. I think it's the
Absolutely.
important thing.
Intention definitely matters. And I think even when it comes to like allyship, like you asked earlier about like how you can respond to someone, just to like wrap it up, I think that don't be afraid to say the wrong thing. Just I think you should, you know, just go and do it anyways, and learn along the way. So what if you
Yeah.
fail? So what if you see the wrong thing? The intention was there to help, right? And I think the less that people shut down people that say the wrong things or cancel people for that kind of thing, it's the intention to learn and grow that really matters.
Thanks so much.